Hey guys, in this video I would like to show you my workflow of how I managed to create a MIDI drum trigger out of an acoustic drum recording in Ableton Live without using a plugin. If you want to jump right into the action, use the chapter markers below. Otherwise, I would first like to talk about drum triggering in general, as well as why I need to trigger drums in this particular case. With my band Extreme Mind, we recently recorded our album Hearing the Bigger Picture. What you see here are 16 files representing the stem files of only the drum recording. It turns out that the kick and the snare need a little more punch. That's why we decided to boost the drum sound through triggering. In case you don't know what that means, drum triggering means that you take the acoustic signal of a drum and turn that into a MIDI signal. This MIDI information can then be fed into a sampler to create different drum sounds, either to beef up the sound of the drums or to replace them overall with another sound. There are two main workflows to turn your drums into MIDI in your production process. You can either trigger drums during the recording already by attaching drum trigger modules onto your drum kit, or you can create that MIDI information after you've already recorded your drums using the recorded audio files and turning them into MIDI clips, which is what I'm going to do. Here again, there are different ways to approach it. The easiest way is to use a drum trigger plugin, like for example Trigger 2 by Steven Slate Drums. Since I don't own any drum trigger plugin, but would still like to get the work done, I decided to use Ableton Live's Convert to MIDI option and see how it is going. I imagine other DAWs would have similar features that help users turn their audio clips into MIDI information. I'm just used to work with Ableton. Tell me in the comment section if you have experience doing such things with other programs. I'm sharing my workflow here. There are often 1,000 different ways to get to the same result in the world of electronic audio processing. I imagine there are tons of people who would have achieved the same goal in more efficient ways. If you are one of those people, I'd love to hear about your approach in the comment section. That said, let's get to work. Alright, let's start by importing the drum stem files into Ableton via drag and drop. Normally, Ableton would want to place the clips in a single track, which we don't want to happen. But by holding Control on Windows or Command on Mac, they get placed each on their own track. Great. Now let's listen to what that sounds like. Cool. If I turn on the metronome, you can hear that the project tempo doesn't match the tempo of the song. There's one thing you should absolutely know when creating MIDI files. Unlike audio clips, MIDI clips are inherently dependent on the tempo of your project. So if you change the tempo of your project, the tempo of your MIDI clips will change too. I'm right now creating MIDI files that I will give to our producer, so that he can use them to beef up the sound of the drums in the mix. MIDI files store tempo information. He's going to import the MIDI files that I created into his project. Now I know that his project is set to the tempo of the song, which is 130 BPM. So before creating the MIDI information here, I have to set the tempo of my project to 130 BPM too. If I leave this to 120 BPM, create some MIDI information here, and send him the files, he will be confronted with MIDI clips that are not in the right tempo, and thus useless. So let's set the project tempo to 130. Now, the tempo of the song is changing later, which again is also taken into account in the project of our producer, so I have to make the tempo change here too. I'm right-clicking onto the tempo field and choosing Show Automation. Now I can draw an automation for the tempo in this project. I'm going to the exact time that the tempo change occurs in the song and adjust the tempo to 190 BPM. Perfect. We have to choose the clips that we want to turn into MIDI. I'll start with the snare. The snare has been recorded with 3 different microphones. I'm going to choose the track that has the strongest snare signal whilst containing the least amount of bleeding from the rest of the drums. This one sounds fine to me. I'm right-clicking the clip and selecting Convert Drums to New MIDI Track. This created a MIDI track with a MIDI clip containing the information that Ableton interpreted from our audio clip. Looks like Ableton found a kick drum, a snare, as well as a hi-hat from that audio. We don't care about kick and hi-hat. I'm also deleting all other sample tracks from the drum rack for the sake of simplicity. I want to see how well Ableton did, so I'm soloing the audio clip as well as the new MIDI clip and adjusting the volume so that we can hear them together. Let's make both clips yellow. And check for mistakes. Here's one missing. Looks like we're not done here. I'll have to draw in a few notes by hand. You can probably imagine, just by looking at the length of this video, that this process took actually most of my time. Now here's one typical example why I think Ableton's arrangement view usability is still way behind other DAWs like Cubase or Pro Tools. Ableton is great when it comes to allowing creative workflows in electronic music creation and sound design, and unbeatable in live performance environments. But when it comes to editing your arrangement, I've just made much better experience with other programs. The problem is, I want now to draw a note into the MIDI clip exactly at the time where the audio is playing a snare hit. I can zoom into the audio in the arrangement window and put my marker on the exact time, but the marker doesn't show up in the MIDI clip. So there is no way for me to draw a note at the correct time, which is annoying, but I have found a way to work around it. In the arrangement view, after zooming in, I mark the exact location of the snare hit on the MIDI clip and press Ctrl E or Command E on Mac. This cuts the clip in half. Now when I click on the right half of that MIDI clip, the clip view window shows the exact starting time of that clip. That way I have located precisely where I need to draw in the note. Great. Now I also need to set the velocity of that note according to the original signal, which I can just read off from those transients. Now let's set up the screen for the best workflow, making 4 areas visible: the original audio clip, the new MIDI clip, the MIDI clip window both for drawing notes as well as for setting the velocity. Also, I strongly recommend to use the follow function in Ableton to avoid losing the cursor or getting lost when zooming in or out, which you're gonna have to do a lot. In this process I have to turn it on and off all the time, so I quickly memorize the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-F on Windows or Command-Shift-K on Mac. I think we will do this work in 2 parts. First I'll do all the cuts to mark all missing notes on the MIDI clip, then I'll draw all the notes in. After about half an hour of work I found all missing snare hits. Now let's draw the notes. To make the workflow even more efficient, I recommend using copy-paste. Since in a lot of grooves the hits have a similar velocity, I simply go to each marked position and paste them in. Awesome, the work is done. Now I'm putting all those cut MIDI clips back together by consolidating them. I'm marking them all and pressing Ctrl-J in Windows or Command-J in Mac. Believe it or not, but I also did the same work for the kick too. But with a little bit of practice I actually got quite fast and efficient. Sounds good to me. Alright, last step. I'm exporting the MIDI clips by selecting them and clicking File, Export MIDI Clip. And of course, before sending the files to a producer, I'm double checking if they are correct by importing them back into the project. Ableton asks me if I want to import the time signature data into the project. This is a great showcase for what I said earlier about the tempo of a project being super important for the MIDI information. MIDI files store tempo data. So again, before creating MIDI files that you want to send to someone for further use, set the tempo of your project correctly. In this case, it doesn't matter what I click here since the project already has the right tempo setting for these MIDI files. This looks good to me. Alright, that's it. This is how I approach triggering my drum recordings in Ableton without a plugin. I'm open for feedback. Thanks for watching, tell me if you liked it, if you have other approaches or tips, and of course like and subscribe to my channel. I'm planning to upload similar videos in the future. Bye bye!